Hi, everyone. We'll give it just a couple more minutes to have people join in. Cool. It looks like we have about half of our participants, so we can go ahead and get started. Uh, I just want to start off by saying that I want to let everyone know that this call is being recorded for future playback. If you do not wish to be recorded, now is your chance to leave the call. And with that, I will kick it off. So hello, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of our digital advocacy webinar series, where we'll do a deeper dive into emails. My name is Ali Rahimi. I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Manager for Voices for Healthy Kids. Joining me today is Nick Dean, Director of Digital Strategy at Burness. Building on the first installment, this training will dive into the writing and planning that goes into advocacy email. We'll cover the parts every good email is made of, review examples of strong advocacy emails, and cover best practices to use when writing advocacy emails. Next slide. Some general housekeeping before we get started. I just want to reiterate that this call is being recorded and will be available early next week for playback. So again, if you do not wish to be recorded, now is your second chance to leave the call. All lines are muted and questions should be placed in the chat, and we will be actively monitoring the chat throughout the course of the presentation. We will also have time at the end for questions. Next slide. So before we officially begin, I want to throw in a quick plug for the next 2 parts of the webinar series. On September 2nd, we will go over how Voices for Healthy Kids can boost your campaigns using our grassroots resources. And on September 16th, we'll discuss the lessons learned from the advocacy boom during the COVID-19 pandemic. Registration for these events will be available via email following this event. And please note that the next 2 sessions will take place in September. Next slide. Cool. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. So for those of you who may have missed my initial introduction, my name is Ali Rahimi, and I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Manager for Voices for Healthy Kids. My role is to help campaigns with grassroots strategies through accessing grassroots networks and providing technical assistance. Today, I'll be providing a high-level overview of the grassroots component of the Power Prism. If you participated in part 1 of this training, this portion might be a bit of a review, but it will be a good chance to reinforce what you learned just a couple weeks ago. Next slide. So before we do our deep dive into emails, I want to touch on grassroots. When writing emails, it's important to remember that these emails are going out to real people. And the Grassroots and Key Contacts tool of the Power Prism will help you understand the important role that people play in an advocacy program, which will help you write better emails to drive mission advancement. Next slide. The first thing I want to touch on is identifying grassroots advocates and the role that they play. Grassroots advocates are the people who have a connection to elected officials because they are constituents. And as you know, hearing from constituents is important to lawmakers. Just a handful of letters or phone calls from grassroots advocates can make legislators take notice and act on an issue. Web-based point-and-click action networks like the one you see on the right are a great way to introduce people to grassroots advocacy. Your organization can use online networks to help identify grassroots advocates who are willing to take offline action through phone calls, letter writing, and visits to decision makers, and the latter of which was probably virtual during the pandemic. Next slide. Once you've identified your grassroots advocates, it's important to know how to engage them. And the key to that engagement is understanding why your activists are invested in your issue. And understanding that why can help you transform your advocates into leaders that you rely on to build relationships with decision makers. And those leaders can in turn convey your message to the media and share their personal stories in support of your issues. Next slide. So as we talk about leaders, it's also important to know who the Grasstops Advocates are. Grasstops Advocates are people who are more likely to get direct information from a decision maker, in this case, a lawmaker, because they either have special expertise or position, or they have a personal relationship with the decision maker. You can identify a Grasstops advocate by asking your grassroots advocates about relationships that they have with decision makers or anyone connected to the decision maker. And you can also recruit Grasstops advocates by researching a lawmaker's interests and affiliations and then forming relationships with leaders in those organizations. And by going through this process, you might actually be surprised by the connections your grassroots already have to pathways of influence in your campaign. Next slide. The last thing I want to cover is identifying your network. What I mean by this is that it's important to know who's in your network so that you can more effectively work and communicate with them. Your organization's mission can be enhanced by connecting members of your network to decision makers and leaders in your community. And in terms of crafting strong advocacy email, knowing your audience, which is your network, can help you better reach them. The questions presented on the slide can help you identify who you know and how you can leverage those connections to reach and influence decision makers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nick Dean, the Director of Digital Strategy at Burness.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks for having me today. It's nice to see you all. Hopefully some of you I saw a couple weeks ago at our first session. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We'll get started with the email writing portion of today. Okay. So first, I just want to talk about our agenda for today. The first session we did a couple weeks ago, we talked about parts of a digital advocacy program overall. We talked tools, calendars, content, and then we also talked about the best practices for using those. Today, what we're doing is we're deep diving into one specific part of an advocacy program online, which is email. It's a really big part. It's a part that's been around for a while and it's evolving. But what I hope that we'll learn today is a little bit about how to write or edit emails for advocacy work. So there is both an art and a science to this writing. There's some things that we've learned over time that are best practices to make emails and help emails along the way. And there's also some things in terms of the content itself, the art of writing, that I think can help when you're drafting emails for a campaign that you're working on, or when you're reviewing emails for a campaign. Maybe you're helping someone along the way think about how they want to be talking to their constituents and getting more people to take action online. So first up, I want to start at the very base level and just dissect an email, because we probably get all hundreds of emails a day. But when we start thinking about it as an advocacy tool, there are actually specific parts, especially for what we call email marketing. So I want to talk through the parts, and then I want to show an example. We've got the sender, who this email is appearing to come from, the subject line that, first bite at getting someone's attention. The header image, normally up at the top, something that kind of is either branded to keep consistent or draw the reader's eye. A greeting, the lead, so how are we catching someone and getting them to read the rest? The asks, when are we actually asking readers to do something, and how are we formatting that? The body of the email, what's really the bulk of the email, the story that we're telling, and then the sign off. To visualize this, I have an example from the Obama Foundation, and I just wanted to kind of walk through the different pieces as you can see them here. So up top, we have a subject line and it reads, "A center to empower our young people, : The sender here is from Michelle Obama. The header image has the Obama Foundation logo and website and a kind of designed header at the top. We have a greeting, which is personalized. So it says, "Hi, Nick." So they have information about me that they're using in order to make this feel like I got an email from Michelle Obama, which is not a bad feeling to have. A lead. So that's the first sentence in your email, the thing that can either turn people on or turn people off into reading more. If we keep scrolling down, the first ask. So this email was talking about what they had to say around this new center and what the Obama Presidential Center would be about. And so they're asking them to take a look at this video and see what they have to say about that. And then what I would call the second ask of this email is the actual image of still from the video and a play button to watch it. So what they're asking people to do in this is to watch this video and then share it. And then we have the sign off here from Michelle Obama, pretty simple, Michelle. So these are all the parts that we have to think about when we're drafting email. So if you pull up a Word document or a Google document, you start drafting, sometimes people skip all the way down to the lead, but there's a ton of decisions to be made and the strategy behind creating email marketing, who we're sending it from, what that subject line is, what it looks like, how it's designed, and again, what the content is. We're going to talk about all of these various pieces today. So what makes a great email? Well, I have 4 main questions that if you ask when you're writing or reviewing emails can really help you decide whether or not this is a good advocacy email. The first question has to do with the moment. Why are you sending me this email? I think about this a lot because I work in email a lot. And I'm often wondering, what value is this email bringing me that I have in my inbox? Why did the organization consider sending it in this moment? What about right now meant you need to send me an email? Is there a vote coming up? Is there something that I need to do because something was just announced? Do you need to do something because you need support to sustain the campaign? There are a variety of ways and moments. There's cultural moments, there's moments we know from holidays, there's campaign moments and milestones because of the way the campaign is structured and the key votes or key decisions that are coming out. Knowing what that moment is helps you answer why you're sending me this email. If I, as the reader, don't understand why you're sending me this email, I'm not very likely, if I don't understand the moment, or if you don't tell me what that moment is, I'm not very likely to see why there's any urgency to me doing anything that you're asking me to do. The second question is about action. What can I do about it? So it can sound very urgent to people working on a campaign that this hearing is happening, or that this bill is being considered and that we need to hear from real people. But if you can't tell me that why my voice is actually going to change anything, if you can't tell me how that action that I'm doing, like what I can actually do about it, then I'm going to feel a little bit lost. Sometimes advocacy emails can focus a ton on the process or a ton on the moment, and not get down to the action that you need me to take. We shouldn't, our readers really shouldn't be confused about the action. What they can do about it is what this email is all about. So we have to make sure that that's a priority. Our third question has to do with the theory of change. So how will taking this action help? So again, it's great that you told me what I can do. It's great that you told me why I need to do it right now, the moment, but also I need to know that how this is going to help the overall theory of change, how my email to a legislator today is going to help us with our long-term goal of changing this policy and improving people's lives. So we have to always be coming back to the theory of change of the campaign and making it crystal clear and repeating over and over again that your participation in this is going to help change something for the better. So that theory of change is really important. So when you're reading your emails, have you answered how will taking this action help? And then our fourth question is urgency. Why do I have to do it right now? Can I do it next week? Can I do it tomorrow? Can I do it in a couple hours? Do I really even have to do it at all? Urgency is really important, but it has to be real. So one of my biggest pet peeves is emails with fake urgency. Sometimes there really isn't a deadline. Sometimes there really isn't a very urgent request. And when that happens, we have to make the urgency more tied to that theory of change, or more tied to the policy change we're looking for, or the change in people's lives. It's urgent because it will make people's lives easier. It's urgent because it will improve people's lives. It's urgent because of the health of people. It's urgent because of X. thinking of urgency not just being time bound when you don't have a time bound urgency moment, but also urgency in the sense of we have to do this because of X, Y, and Z reasons. It's just really important to be very careful about urgency. As I said, I think it's really, we'll talk about this later, authenticity in email always pays off. And so if you use false urgency, as I call it, in your emails, you can expect list members to flee, and you can also expect your trust to decrease. So people will start to trust your brand less. Over time, your emails will be open less. You'll have to replace your advocates even more. And so you really want to be thoughtful about when you use urgency. If there is a moment, if there is a deadline, if it does need to happen right now, let's just make sure that's really clear to our readers. So these are our 4 questions. Moment, why are you sending me this email? Action, what can I do about it? Theory of change, how will taking this action help? And urgency, why right now do I have to take this action? If you have those 4 things in an email, you are on a really good path for a great advocacy email. Knowing that, what I want to do is give everyone a minute to read this draft email from Colin Allred's congressional campaign in 2017, 2018, a while ago. So I'll give everyone a couple minutes to read through this. It starts on the left and ends on the right. And we're also going to put in the chat, there's a Google Doc with this text. If that's easier for anyone to read, you can find the link in the chat. It's an accessible document to be able to read by yourself or screen read. But I'll give everyone a few moments, and what I want you to do is to be looking for the 4 things. Moment, why are you sending this to me? Action, what can I do about it? Theory of change, how will this help? And urgency, why right now? So I'll give everyone a few minutes to read this first section. Everything you need is up at the top on the left here. All right, now I want to talk through a couple of these. If you have yours written down, see if you got them right. The first one around moment might be a little bit difficult because this is kind of an older email. But if you remember, there was a whole time where the president was making comments around football players protest, kneeling in protest during the national anthem, and had made some comments. This email was a rapid response email around that moment. So the moment here is at the NFL kneeling protest. Colin Allred was a former football player for the Tennessee Titans, and NFL protests were just right along with who he was as a person and his personal story. And so he sent this email around this moment to kind of make it known where he stood. The action, what can you do about this, is to donate. And that's tied to a theory of change that Colin Allred's theory was, our leaders are dividing us and I will unite people. I need money to be elected. So you can see that here where he says, I'm running for Congress because I believe that what unites us is much more powerful than what divides us. And if you agree, donate. And so this is a little bit harder for you to follow along. It doesn't as piecemeal, but I think it gives a good job of telling a story while at the same time maintaining each of these things. And then finally, where we see the urgency is that there's a real fundraising deadline this Saturday. I believe that this was at the end of the quarter. And so it's very common for political campaigns to use end of quarter emails and deadlines as an urgency request to say, you know, these numbers are going to be looked at. People are going to be judging our campaign on how successful it is. If we get the money in time, our deadline is Saturday. So why do I have to donate right now? Well, if this was sent on a Thursday or Friday, I only have a couple days left. So those are those 4 moments kind of played out in an email. Next, I want to go kind of detail. We've talked about the 4 questions that can help you anytime you're writing an advocacy email. Now I just want to talk about some of the best practices around email writing. When you're sitting down to write advocacy emails, some things that you should always consider, or even if you're editing them, things you should see if the writer you're reviewing has done. The first thing about good emails is that good emails have good writing. So it's not always just about email and digital. It's very common to say, oh, digital shorter, it's different. It does have its own quirks and things you have to consider. But in general, good writing is good writing. So you want to be succinct. You want to be using clear and straightforward sentences throughout your emails. You really don't want it to be confusing, especially because it's online. But in general, good writing is clear and succinct. You want to always be answering the 4 questions that we just talked about. You want, obviously, to have your emails be free of typos and grammatical errors. And the key there is review. Have someone look at this, have someone look at it again. Just make sure it's run through spell check, check out for any of those typos. And then finally, there really is, I get this question a lot. Okay, well, I wrote this email, but it's only 150 words, or I wrote this email that's 1,500 words. There really is no perfect length to an email. The goal is to get the point across in the most efficient and engaging way possible. We'll say it's really rare that someone's going to read a 1,500 word email because it's really rare that someone's going to read a 1,500 word article. And so if you can say it shorter, you should, especially via email, but there really is no perfect length. I know, for instance, an organization like Greenpeace, which I talked about in the last training, they have learned over time that their list wants the details, they want the nitty gritty. Their emails are a lot longer than, say, the email we saw from the Obama Foundation about the Presidential Center. So your list can also tell you, and you can learn over time, what the good length of an email is for your list. But in general, the rule is if it's valuable and it's good writing, it's probably just the right length. So if good emails are good writing, the next thing I would say is that good emails are authentic. Your email should always sound like it comes from a real person. Ali made a really great point about there are real people on the other side of all of our digital advocacy work. We always need to be talking to them as if we are real people, because we are. It's human to human communication. It's really easy to slip into more formal mass messaging. So saying you all are the reason that we need, and all of you, and blah, blah, blah. But you saw in that example email I showed at the beginning of today's training that it was addressed just to me. It said, hi, Nick, and then I went through. I know that Michelle Obama didn't sit down to write this email, but it sounded like her. And that's really important because most of our emails, someone has sat down to write to us. So when you get a marketing email or mass email, following a best practice of sounding real and sounding authentic can improve open rates. It can also make the person just more engaged with the content that you're sending. You really don't want to be impersonal or overly formal. So again, emails are oftentimes short between each other and at work. They're also pretty personal. They're not normally overly formal. So it doesn't need to be like, dear sirs and madams on our email list, here's what we think about blah, 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 blah. It needs to feel a little bit more impersonal than that. It needs to feel like you're talking to me through the screen. You really want to respect your readers' intelligence and time. So this is where I say creating false urgency doesn't work. People are not dumb. People can see through those tactics, and it's just disrespectful to your list. And then you also want to respect your readers' time by not sending them every single thing that you think should be an email, unless you can answer those 4 questions and there's real value in sending an email. A lot of times I see organizations fall into the trap of sending email because they said they would, and really it's probably better to hold and send an email when you have something valuable to say. Lastly, under good emails are authentic, I'd say that you really want to develop really distinct, what we call sender voices. So every sender should really have a purpose and a personality. Over time, your super supporters, as I call them, people who read all of your emails or most of your emails, are a really big supporter of your organization or your campaign. They want to get to know people. They want to know, oh, this person is this, and they care about this. An example is on Colin Allred's campaign, his finance share would send a bunch of updates around finance updates, how much money was raised, how much money was still needed, what it was supporting. And so you can start to think about these senders as the real people in your organization. Maybe the executive director of your organization has one voice, the head of marketing, or maybe there's a head of campaigns that has a different voice and is a little more like, you know, a rallying cry. You can start to think about what those senders are and what they sound like, and then send emails from those people in those tone of voices. It's really important because we do respond well when we can feel like we know the person on the other end, and oh, this person doesn't sound exactly like the other person at this organization. I have 2 examples of this one. So these 2 emails are from Texas Children's Hospital down in Houston, Texas. The one on the left was from their head of nursing, and the one on their right is the physician in chief, kind of the head of the hospital, Dr. Klein. And I just want to point out a few things on the left in terms of sender voices. Mary Jo Andre says, take it from a nurse. Sometimes laughter is the best medicine. That's why I'm excited about the funny Halloween cards that hundreds of people have already sent to our patients. Don't miss your chance to join in the fun. Send a card today so we can print it out and give it to a patient just in time for Halloween. And then later in her email, she says, anything we can do to make the hospital feel a little bit more like home, including celebrating Halloween, helps to brighten our patients' spirits and distract them from their treatment. So you can tell that she has firsthand experience working with patients. She's the head of nursing, and she's thinking about this as from a nurse, from that experience, and she's making a compelling ask from that. On the right, we have Dr. Klein, who kind of leads the whole hospital, and he starts out very differently. Every day, more and more children from Houston and across the state of Texas count on Texas Children's for life-saving treatment. So he has this 30,000-foot view of the hospital, and you can tell he's leading the hospital from that perspective. He talks about how we're heading into the busiest time of year. We will see so many patients with the flu and respiratory infections. And to make sure we're able to meet our patients' needs, we're kicking off our year-end fundraising drive. My promise as physician-in-chief is to ensure that every child who requires complex care always has a place to go for treatment. So embedded in all of the language from Dr. Klein is this idea that he's thinking about this as a leader at Texas Children's Hospital. And I think that's just a really good example of how we think about the tone of voice and the sender personalities of different senders. How somebody who has a background in nursing and is now leading the nurses can bring us into the room with the patient, and how the head of the hospital who's leading from that perspective can talk about kind of the 30,000-foot view. You can think of those own kind of sender personalities for people on your campaign. Maybe you send from a volunteer. I just got done doing my first volunteer shift on this campaign, and here's what I saw, and I think it'd be great if you joined me. That would be an awesome email to send as a perspective from a volunteer versus just only ever hearing from maybe the campaign's executive director or organizer. So we've talked about how good emails have good writing. We've talked about how good emails are authentic. The last thing is that good emails always have a purpose. So you send your audience content with which they want to engage. It should be something that I would be upset if I didn't hear about this as a supporter, or that I would be mad that I missed out on, right? Your list is made up of real people with busy lives, so we really have to treat them with respect. And I always come back to this question of like, would I want this in my inbox? I think we can all agree that our inboxes are overflowing and we're all competing for space. If you can honestly say that this is an email that you'd want in your inbox, because if you cared about that issue, obviously not everyone cares about every issue, but I'm just saying, if you're a supporter, would you want to get it? That's kind of the last question that I ask when I'm reviewing emails is this something that seems worth time and space of in our supporters' inboxes? Last thing is that formatting is important, and emails should also look good. Now, I don't mean that they all have to be incredibly slick and designed well, but they do need to follow some formatting best practices for people to be able to understand and read them, at least at a basic level. Email formatting is super important. What we bold, how we space out paragraphs, if and when we use bullets, where we're underlining and hyperlinking text and how legible that is, all of that is incredibly important. And email is also a part of your external brand. It should really look that way from a trust perspective. If your brand looks like one thing and then your emails have no connection to that at all, it can be very disorienting and also distrusting. You can think, maybe this is spam. I'm not going to click on this. I don't want to engage with this. An increasing number of emails are read also on mobile phones. And so you really want to make sure they're all optimized for mobile. Most tools like MailChimp, Constant Contact, things like that have this built in. But if you use a different tool, you might want to look into whether or not on your phone, your emails look and scale down to the size of the phone screen. Oftentimes when people start thinking about what their emails look like, they immediately go to graphics. But I will say that I've seen over time working with dozens of programs that graphic emails don't always perform better. Almost always text emails beat out graphics. And I think there's a couple reasons for this. One is a lot of email clients will make you download any graphics before you see them, just as a safety feature. And the second is we're used to getting text emails from our coworkers and our friends and our family. People aren't often sending us graphic emails. And so I think we just all respond a little bit better. Doesn't mean you shouldn't attempt to put graphics. Graphics can be really helpful and supportive, but you shouldn't make your entire email calendar graphic emails. And then you also don't want to be afraid to get what I call ugly. So oftentimes you can think, oh, it doesn't look slick enough, this is too confusing. We also get a lot of automated emails. And I have an example that I'm going to show here in a minute that we formatted to look more automated intentionally. And it performed really well. So you really want to be just more authentic to the kind of email you're sending in its look and its feel. So looking at a couple examples, I just want to point out some of the formatting. This one on the left is from the Coastal Conservation League, an environmental group in South Carolina. Notice that they really wanted people to watch this video. And so they put it up top. It's a very clear play button and then just text. I think this is a really great style and very clean and easy for readers to kind of understand what you want them to do. On the right, this is a wrap up again from Texas Children's Hospital during Thanksgiving. They decided they just really wanted to thank their list supporters and they didn't want to make an ask. This is more of a stewardship send. And so you'll see they use this bold line to say, along with our volunteers, staff, doctors, and nurses, you've made a difference in the lives of so many children in 2017. And then they used bullets to talk about all the ways in which their supporters have helped that year. And then they have this great like kind of collage of images along the bottom. On the left here from Battleground, Texas, you have this really interesting call out at the top that kind of summarizes everything that they're asking later. And you've got a list, so you've got this big button to add your name, and you've got one clear sentence of what you want me to do. You'll see these call outs across, especially political emails that are along the top or along the bottom, something that people try out to say, maybe they're only gonna read this box up here, and then for people who want more information, they're gonna keep reading. And then on the right, this is one that I was talking about that was intentionally styled to look automatic. It was just an update to let people know if they had donated. And so it was a supporter record. It let them know whether or not we had a donation on file for them and then asked them to donate if we didn't. And so we intentionally made this look different and make it look a little bit like the system had sent this out because that's what we were trying to just let people know is whether or not there was a donation on file. Some examples of graphic emails. The one on the left, Jenny's Ice Cream, if anyone's a fan of that. I just loved how visual this is. Obviously they're selling food, so it makes a ton of sense, but it's just, it looks almost like a website, but it's just a one email send. And the one on the right, I use this example a lot when HBO got all the Harry Potter movies because they knew exactly what they needed to say and they said it pretty quickly. Harry is here, stream now. It's a button, a photo of Harry Potter in one sentence. That's all they needed to tell people, and they did a really good job kind of keeping it pretty simple here. Great. So next I'm gonna move to the review section. I've got an email that I wanted everyone to kind of look at and read, and then in the chat, if you could tell me what you like or don't like about it, I'll just give you a couple minutes. So a couple things on this one that I just wanted to point out that I thought were done well is the subject line. My mom wouldn't do this. You saw that up here along the top. Just thought that was a great subject line. I think it's something that would really engage people and think, I wonder what his mom wouldn't do, right? Like this sounds really interesting. Also, you'll see this is from Tom Colicchio, a pretty famous chef. I think they used formatting really well here. They tell a really interesting story, a personal story about his mother, and then they have the very clear call to action here. Join me in calling on the Secretary of Agriculture. And so I just think they used some very basic things here. It's just text and formatting, but they were pretty thoughtful about what they did. Yeah, Colby is saying the same thing. Cool. So here's another one, this one again from the Coastal Conservation League. I'll give you just a couple minutes. A couple things about this one that I wanted to point out. The ask is pretty buried, right? We've got a ton of text here, and then down here at the bottom, it says nearly 3,000 Coastal Conservation League members have signed our petition thanking Governor McMaster for support, but it doesn't outright say that I should sign that too. And so I think it's just a little bit buried. I would move it up top and make it pretty clear when we think about those 4 questions, what we want to ask people to do. The other thing I like is how they do get to the point and they give me some pretty big details here around 1,200 local, state, and federal officials, 150 municipalities, 26 coastal communities, kind of overwhelming in these stats, but in a way that I think is really interesting. And so I think what I would have done is just switched out this bold section to make this really where your eye is drawn to where I would put that call to action again to really make sure that people understand what we're asking them to do. So I want to talk a little bit about the last thing around here is email tactics. Some of the things we can think about and from a tactical perspective, calendaring, types of sends, those kinds of things. And then we'll close out for questions. So first up, your calendar is a huge tactic. How and when you're sending emails and what you're talking about is really important. So you always want to create a really cohesive email calendar and I kind of think about 4 different sends: action emails, stewardship emails, report backs, and rapid response. Most of those are going to make up your email calendar. An action email, very clear, we want people to take action. A stewardship email is a little bit like the one we saw around Texas Children's Hospital and the thank you for Thanksgiving. They were just thanking people for all the work they had done as supporters of Texas Children's Hospital and what they've made possible. They were stewarding their list. Report backs, I think, are incredibly important. I talked about this a little bit in the first session. But when you are working on something and someone has participated in it early on, you want to make sure that you let that action taker know what happened. Sometimes it doesn't always fall in your favor. But in general, you want to make sure that you're giving report backs on how that went. Some people will do report backs just to the action takers. You were one of 1,100 names of people who submitted their names to a petition on X, Y, and Z cause, and thank you so much. And because of that, this change has happened. Or thank you so much for adding your voice to this fight. It didn't go our way, but that's why we're committed to continuing this work. Lastly, around rapid response, some things are just going to pop up. You can't plan for them. They're just going to come up. And then you're going to want to think about how you respond and send that email out quickly. Sometimes you can capitalize on moments, and you'll want to make sure that you can think about how that's handled. So those 4 really make up your email calendar, and you want to make sure that you've got emails going out consistently that cut across all 4 of these. And the last thing I want to talk about is that good emails really have creative subject lines. Another tactic here is to think about how you use subject lines as a way to get attention to your emails. People really do decide to open your emails based on the subject line, and so you really want to make it good. You want to keep the subject line really short, catchy, and relevant, and in that order, right? So it needs to be succinct because there's not a lot of space. It needs to be catchy, and I don't mean like kitschy or cliche, but catchy in that, oh, that's interesting. I would want to open that and learn more. And then relevant, it shouldn't mislead your audience. It shouldn't be an interesting subject line with a boring email or things that just don't match up. And so they should always, the subject line doesn't need to be overly formal. It should be somewhat short and pithy, and it should draw attention, but it doesn't have to be, please read this email about X, right? You can have a little bit of fun with it, I guess I'd say. So a fun question I always ask is, does anyone know what President Obama's 2012 most successful subject line was? It was just hey, from Barack Obama himself. And so again, also don't get too nervous about having to have too much fun with it. Sometimes a simple hey can work. This raised the most money via email for the Obama campaign back in 2012. The last tactic I want to talk about is what we call zombie sends. So we talked a little bit about some of the open rates of emails. 15% to 20% is a pretty good average of opens. So that means that there's a whole swath of people on your list who are not opening and seeing the emails that you're sending. And when you are trying to drive action, that can be really critical to get as many people to see it as possible. You can use this tactic called the zombie send to resend an email to people who just didn't open it the first time. Maybe they missed it, maybe they accidentally deleted it, maybe it got, swarmed by all the other emails in their inbox and you just want another bite at the apple. A lot of email tools will allow you to do this. You can find out who hasn't opened an email, create that as a list, and then send it with maybe a new subject line and try something new, or the same subject line and just kind of bump it up in people's email inbox. But I use this as a tactic a lot in my recommendations with our partners, just because I know that I miss a ton of email. I know most people miss a ton of email, especially if they're marketing. And if it's valuable content that we really want our supporters to see, it's worth trying to get in front of them again. So consider using this kind of zombie send where you bring this email back to life. And the good thing is, when done correctly using the tool, it will not be sent to people who already opened it and who already took action. So you are not running the risk of seeming redundant or overwhelming people with asks when they've already done something. You want to make sure that you vetted the list and that the tool is working correctly, so that people who've opened it and took action on that email address are not seeing this zombie send. I wanted to show this as an example of a calendar, because a lot of times people think, oh, I have this one thing, I want people to send emails to legislators and that's it. But that's really not the only thing that you can do. When you have one ask, you can send it 4 times. And so this is an example of that. Maybe you send an all text email first from the organization with a link to take the action. And then next, maybe you send a topper email with a note from the executive director. And a topper, just says, hey, I hope you saw this email that was sent 3 days ago. It's really important. Please take action now if you can. Third, a zombie send that we just talked about to non-openers. So again, another bite at the apple to people who haven't seen any of these emails yet. And then fourth, right before the deadline or right the day of the deadline, a really deadline-centric email from the campaign lead saying, like, tomorrow's the day or today's the day. Please take action. So that's an example of how you can stretch. You may think you have one ask for your list, and you do, but there is a way to make kind of 4 valuable emails out of that are interesting, engaging, and allow your supporters to kind of get to know the organization. Okay, that's the kind of training session section. So we were going to move to any questions.
Yeah, Nick, I'll start off by saying we had a couple comments about Colin Allred's email. So looking at that football example, who was the audience? The football example may not resonate with people or everyone on the list. So was it written for a specific audience?
I think it was written for his list, I believe. I've used it as an example just for kind of using the moment action theory of change and urgency. I definitely did not mean if any of the content didn't resonate with you or struck you in a way that was offensive. I apologize for that. I'm just seeing some of the chats there now, but I just meant more that they followed that structure in that format.
Thanks.
Yeah.
We have another question about more information on zombie sends. So what platforms do zombie sends work on, and do you need constant contact for them?
You don't have to have constant contact. I know that it works on MailChimp, and I would just check. There's so many email tools out there, but you don't only have to have constant contact. It's a common feature across email tools. You can, if for whatever reason your tool doesn't do that, what you could do is go into, let's say if your email, for instance, is to have someone send a letter to a legislator via maybe phone to action, the tool that we've talked about, you can you could go into phone to action, find out who's taken the actions, and remove them from your next send, so that you make sure you're only emailing people who have not taken action on that campaign before. That'd be a little bit more manual, but if your tool didn't have a built-in way to know who's opened and received and clicked on emails, that's one way that you could do it.
Thanks. Next question is about using emojis in subject lines. Yay or nay?
I think yay. I love emojis. I think they're great. What I like about emojis is that if it doesn't fit with your tone, maybe you have a pretty serious tone or serious topic, there are a lot of emojis that just represent symbols like arrows or charts or line graphs or X's and check marks and things like that. There are things that aren't as, emojis kind of get a bad rap sometimes of just being like fun and playful. But what I like about emojis now is they've built out is that there's actually a lot that are pretty serious and data driven, or just symbols themselves that are more visual. So I definitely think you should try it. if you have a more playful tone, or you're comfortable being more playful, then definitely use those. But also don't shy away from them if you're on a more serious topic or you're taking a more serious tone, because there still are ways to visualize things using emojis that will catch readers' eye a little bit better.
And in that same vein about, making your emails visually pop, what are your thoughts on using images or buttons in the email body?
I think that you definitely should try it. I think what I try to do when I'm reviewing an email is have a little bit for everyone in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming. So for instance, maybe one sentence is hyperlinked that links to the page. There's a button later, and then maybe there's a PS with another hyperlink. I think we all kind of consume emails differently. And so a button maybe won't be inherently clickable to some people, or also won't be a thing you'll click on, but the text would, and then vice versa for someone else. So I definitely think you should try it. I don't know that it's a prerequisite. Like, you don't have to just have a button in every single email. If it's pretty clear that you can click on it, that makes sense. But I definitely would attempt and see if it helps increase any of your rates.
Awesome. Question from the chat. So some people noticed that some of the examples that you provided were ads and others were for advocacy campaigns. So where's the line between selling something and asking for something? How do you navigate the marketing and advocacy divide?
Yeah, I guess you meant the two. The person probably meant the two emails I showed from Jenny's Ice Cream and HBO. I use those more as just like setup examples, because you can make things pretty visual and pretty clear with just a button and a photo. But I don't know. I guess I don't really understand the question that much. I would just say that, like, in general, I would try to diversify the way your emails look until you really have found more what your list likes. When you're first getting started, you may assume everyone wants graphic emails that look like ads, but actually they respond much better just all text emails. And you won't really know until you start trying different things as you're emailing and seeing how things are performing against one another.
Cool. Another question from the chat. So when you have multiple campaigns or different types of emails going out to people in a geographic area, how do you approach that? So for example, if you have a city where there's a local campaign going on in the same state where there's a campaign or federal campaign going on, how do you, approach that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This goes back to what I call segmenting and list hygiene. So what's really important is that if you have a large list, but you have a statewide campaign and a local campaign in that same state going at the same time, my recommendation would be to make sure those calendars are coordinated. So for instance, if there's something, I'm from Austin, Texas, so I'll just say if there's something happening in Austin, Texas on a local level on your list and in the program you work on, but then there's also a statewide thing for the state of Texas, you can't assume that I wouldn't want to be involved in both. But what you can do is hope that your calendar kind of allows that. So what I'm saying is, like, I wouldn't send an email on a Tuesday to the Texas list and on that same day also send it to the Austin list. I'd try to separate those out. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is have people opt in. So you could send everyone in Austin and let them know, hey, we have this statewide campaign going. We also have this local campaign. Let us know if you're interested in that. Click here. And some of the email tools that you use will allow you to append tags to people's names. So that if I said, I'm interested, I want to hear about this Austin campaign, you could, in the back end of the system, tag me as Austin campaign and know that I'm interested in that and I want to hear about both of them. And so it's a little bit of coordinating your calendars at first when you're starting to build your list and figure out who you're talking to and prioritizing. If, for instance, your organization decides the Austin campaign is really important and let's only talk to people in Austin about that campaign for the next 3 months, you can also just take the list of people located in Austin and what I'd say, like, separate it out and suppress them from any national or statewide list sends until the Austin campaign is over. If you're just getting started, what you want to be looking at on, like, an email tool side is the segments and tagging and the form structure of how you're getting people tagged, so that I'm Nick Dean, I live in Austin, I care about X, Y, and Z thing. That's all information on my data record in the back end of, like, MailChimp or Constant Contact, that then you can pull a list and say, give me everyone in Austin and let me email them. But it starts with your data, knowing who the person is, where they're located, what they're interested in, and getting that information tagged and all done correctly.
Cool. Another question. So, uh, can you address the differences in terms of the devices that people access their emails on? So that differences in reading emails through phone versus tablet versus laptop.
Yeah. So the main difference is just right. One, the size of the screen. So if an email is mobile optimized, it's actually optimized for any screen size. And so when you're looking, I'm using a big desktop monitor here. When you're using that desktop monitor, if I can see everything kind of full width, but then when I'm on my phone, it's going to scrunch everything to be about, this size. And so what'll happen is a short paragraph on my desktop phone might actually take up half my phone screen. And so you have to, on my desktop, monitor will take up half my phone screen. And so that's why we say using short sentences is pretty important, because we know how many people are reading on mobile. So largely it's just how long you're going to have to scroll on your phone and when you get to the action and how much you can see. So if your ask is buried at the bottom of your email and most people are reading on their phone, it takes 3 or 4 scrolls to get there. That's one of the big reasons why we say we should move the ask higher up in the email, because we actually don't trust that people are going to scroll that far before they see what they need, what we're asking them to do. So that's one big thing. Another thing is email clients, actually. So like at Burness, we have Outlook for our work email. It requires me to download images to see them in any email. So when organizations send me a graphic email, like a designed email, and I'm using my work email to see that, I actually have to go through an extra step before I can see anything. So sometimes it's just a blank email from an organization until I press download. And so if you saw that a ton of your list, and this is something some tools will tell you, a ton of your list is using Outlook, you might want to consider how many graphic emails you're doing, or if you send Outlook emails a different email. It can get pretty sophisticated and down into the weeds. A lot of people will download them. You can also include an alt. I would always include alt image text, but you can also have people opt in to just receive non-HTML emails, and there's lots of different ways you can kind of help to make sure everyone's having a good experience on the device that they're using.
Another question that we had is that it says that we use Constant Contact and have a large number of signups, but many people don't click on the confirm email link, so they're not receiving our emails. Any tips?
Trying to think about what I would do in that scenario. Well, one, you might want to put on the form that you're going to receive an email. Please click, right? So you could think about a 1 or 2 sentence description towards the bottom where you're hitting submit, like, submit your name and email and make sure you look for a confirmation email from us. And that could help a little bit. People may think, oh, I signed up, I don't have to do anything else. That's the best tactic I have off the cuff to try for that one.
Cool. So the next question is that when you're talking about an email calendar, are there certain online social media planning tools that you use, or do you just simply use a Google Calendar?
I use a Google Doc. It's like a Google spreadsheet often, and I have like the email date that we're going to send it, the name of the email, subject line, sender, a link to the draft. I just use a Google spreadsheet for planning. You can also use a Word document or a Google document or a SharePoint document, any of those things. I often just write it out where I kind of see, I've done this with you all at Voices, Ali, where we'll just say like Monday, we're sending from this person, here's the subject line, here's the body of the email, and just put it all together as a calendar to be able to look at. I don't really use any tools for calendaring the way that I would like for like social media post, I guess.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that we have is that for a lot of political campaigns, the name in the sender field is often changed, and that can help when the name is recognizable, but usually it can get confusing when it's random volunteers or other unrecognizable names. So can you comment on any strategy around this?
Yeah, and the political space has done a ton, and I think you have to be really, again, authenticity is pretty key here. I think if you were introducing a sender to the list for the first time, which you theoretically would know because you've never sent an email from them before, it's important to say upfront an introduction. Hey, I'm Nick Dean. I'm the Director of Digital Strategy. Like if I were to send an email from Bernas, introduce me like you would if I were in a room across from you and meeting you for the first time. You might see a decrease in open rates for new senders at the beginning because they're just like, we're not sure who this is. I'm not going to open this, right? But there's also the reverse. Some people are like, oh, this random person has emailed me. Let me open this. And then I'm like, oh, I didn't know that was from Bernas. So it can really go both ways on your list. I will say that it's important to be honest. Some people have changed the from field to say like their own person's name to confuse them to get them to open it. Some people have changed the from field and then it has nothing to do with what's in the email. I think all of that really, for me and kind of my own theory of good email marketing, good digital best practices, is really inauthentic and disrespectful to people's list. And so I wouldn't recommend it. But if you're sending from someone for the first time, consider doing an introduction. I also would say consider putting the organization name in the from field. So Nick Dean, Bernas or Bernas Digital, or, you know, if you can fit it, because then it'll let people know, oh, they work at Bernas, right? Or trying to fit your organization name in the first subject line so that if they don't know the name, they do know who the organization is.
Thanks, Nick. And I'll pose one question. It's not so much related to the content of emails, but it's a question that I get asked often is that, does it matter the time of day an email is sent or the day of the week that you send an email? Does that affect open rates?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can't say that it doesn't, but I will say that in general, a lot of research has been done in this. And the general rule is there is no perfect day or time to send an email. There are always stipulations, or like, I guess I would say like qualifications to that rule. For instance, let's say your list is all teachers and you know that. Maybe don't send it in July when you know nobody's working because they're teachers. And so I think it's a little bit about knowing who your list is, but there isn't like a known date, time of the week that works. I would say this goes hand in hand with the kind of style of your emails and the design of your emails to test it. You might learn that your particular list never responds well to emails on Fridays, but you only know that because you've been over time learning that. There's nothing out there that says everybody will open emails on Wednesday at noon. That's the best time to send them always. So you want to be testing.
Thanks, Nick. So we're almost at time. And so with that, we'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you everyone for joining this training. We hope it was informative and helpful. I want to remind you to register for the next training session on September 2nd. That will go over how Voices for Healthy Kids can help you support your campaigns. We also posted a link in the chat for an evaluation survey of this training session, and we encourage you to take the survey as we greatly appreciate your feedback. Thank you again for joining.